A few months ago in Shanghai, I rode in one of the most impressive cars I'd ever seen. It was a HiPhi. Silent, futuristic, with falcon wing doors and technology that felt years ahead of most. I asked my friend about the company. He smiled and said, "They've gone bankrupt." And HiPhi isn't alone. At least a dozen major Chinese EV manufacturers have collapsed in recent years. Most people think China's rise is a story of state planning and national champions. But if you've ever felt that that narrative doesn't quite add up, if you've wondered how a centrally planned economy produces so many failures alongside the successes, your instinct is right. The real story is different. If you've ever felt the conventional China narrative doesn't make sense, this is why. I'm Adam Dixon, the Adam Smith Chair and Director of Panmure House in Edinburgh, the historic home where Adam Smith finished The Wealth of Nations and where modern economics was born. This channel, The Strategic Economy, is where we move beyond the headlines and decode what actually drives the global economy. Not what governments say drives them, not what ideologues claim drives them, but what the evidence shows. Today, China. Because what actually happened in China over the past 40 years or so is essential for understanding the economic future, whether you're investing, building policy, or just trying to make sense of the world. Now, the conventional narrative goes a bit like this. China succeeded because a powerful, committed state picked winners, directed capital, and built national champions. Central planning, 5-year plans, state-owned enterprises executing a long-term vision. But this narrative has a problem. It doesn't explain reality. It doesn't explain why HiPhi went bankrupt, despite backing from state-connected investors. It doesn't explain why hundreds of major Chinese firms collapse every year. And it doesn't explain where China's wealth actually came from. And if you follow China closely, you've been probably noticing the contradictions. Beijing talks about picking winners, yet hundreds of firms fail every year. The state claims to direct the economy, yet the most dynamic companies emerged from entrepreneurs the government didn't plan for. The official story doesn't match what you observe. So let's look at what happened actually. Here's what China's own official data shows, and these numbers are remarkable. The private sector creates over 80% of urban employment and drives around 60% of GDP growth. The private sector, not state-owned enterprises, not central planning, private, competitive firms. Here's the shocking part. In 1978, private businesses were illegal in China. Illegal. By 2020, there were over 40 million private companies employing 400 million people. China went from effectively zero private employment to one of the world's largest private sectors in 40 years, while remaining a one-party state. Yes, the state built infrastructure, ports, rail, highways, but the private sector, decentralized and competitive, generated the wealth. Now, this makes people uncomfortable. China hawks want to believe it's all IP theft and subsidies, and there's some truth to that. State planning enthusiasts, on the other hand, want you to believe that brilliant technocrats simply planned better. Both narratives miss the real story. Let me show you how brutal the competition is. Take the EV sector. There are hundreds of manufacturers operating today. A few years ago, there were even more. Yet many have collapsed and many will fail in the years to come. HiPhi collapsed this year or last year. Others like Single Auto or WM Motor, all bankrupt. WM Motor was producing 40,000 cars annually with backing from Baidu and Tencent. The founder, Freeman Shen, had worked at Geely and Volvo. He knew the industry, but that didn't trump market dynamics. Why? Because hundreds of companies were fighting for the same market. Industrial Darwinism at a scale the world has never seen. Or consider state-owned enterprises, of which there are still many. Between 1998 and the early 2000s, more than 25 million SOE workers lost their jobs. That's the entire population of Australia. Massive plants that had operated for decades were shut down. Workers protested. The government didn't save them. The Chinese called this xiagang, being sent down from the post. It was brutal, traumatic, but it was the market sorting winners from losers, even when the state owned the losers. The successful SOEs weren't sheltered. They competed with private firms and foreign multinationals. Market discipline, not state protection. This matters because it reveals the mechanism. Market discipline applied ruthlessly, even when painful. That's what separated China from other state-led development models that failed. And this pattern wasn't limited to traditional industries. Consider Alibaba, a well-known story that is worth retelling. In 1999, Jack Ma gathered 18 of his friends in his apartment to build a business to help Chinese small enterprises access global markets. No government official was in that room. No ministry approved it. He launched Alibaba because he saw a market opportunity the state hadn't tried to regulate. Entrepreneurs moving faster than bureaucrats. This pattern, enabled, of course, by special economic zones and provincial competition, created a vast ecosystem. Many firms failed. The winners, however, created China's prosperity. And this matters because frontier innovation didn't come from ministries or five-year plans. It came from entrepreneurs moving faster than regulators and being allowed to. Now, what about IP theft, subsidies, currency manipulation? All real, all significant. But here's what critics miss. You can't subsidize your way to sustained innovation. You can steal technology, but you still need competitive markets to turn inputs into productivity. That's why subsidized companies still failed. That's why HiPhi went bankrupt. The market killed it. Now, some of you are thinking, this sounds like you're just saying free markets work. But that's not quite it. Let me explain. Adam Smith, not the caricature version, but what he actually argued, didn't advocate for weak government. He argued for effective institutions, property rights you can rely on, contracts that get enforced, courts people trust, rules applied evenly. Now, to be fair, this isn't always the case in China, but they still unleashed markets. Now, the state's job is to create the institutional foundation that allows markets to function, and importantly, to resist the constant temptation to micromanage outcomes. Early reform-era China got this roughly right. The state built infrastructure and it unleashed markets. This allowed an explosion of competitive, decentralized experimentation. And critically, despite a fair bit of protectionism, it has still allowed failure. Firms can go bankrupt. SOEs can be closed. Market discipline functions even when painful. And that's what created the growth, which brings us to today and why I'm concerned. When I was in China recently, someone who spent his career watching these reforms unfold told me something striking. He said, "We succeeded because we liberalized. Now we're turning our back on it." He wasn't being political, just observing the mechanism. The very forces that created the growth are being deliberately suppressed. The pendulum is swinging hard back towards centralized control. Pressure on private tech firms, the so-called whole nation system, which is focused on central direction of innovation, emphasis on national champions over market competition. This is the great test. Can you achieve sustained growth while deliberately dismantling the decentralized competitive mechanisms that created your prosperity? History suggests the answer is no. Control can coordinate, particularly in the short run, but competition discovers over time. And that distinction between coordination and discovery is what will determine which economies thrive over the next decades. If you want this kind of analysis, evidence-based, institutionally grounded, cutting through the ideological noise, this is what the strategic economy is for. Subscribe if you found this useful. It's how we build an audience that values depth over hot takes. The China story reveals something fundamental about how economies grow, and it has implications far beyond China itself. In future episodes, we'll explore state capitalism more directly, look at other models from India to the Gulf and beyond, and examine what the West is getting wrong in its response. Thank you for watching.